When Karoline Leavitt sat down for the interview, she was prepared for a heated discussion. What she wasn't expecting was a moment so incendiary that it would take down one of the most recognizable television hosts overnight. And it happened live, not in a pre-recorded segment where producers could edit, cut, or soften the impact. No, this was raw, unfiltered, and unfolding in real time. Karoline had been invited on to The Morning Current, a political talk show famous for its intense debates and even more intense hosts. Across from her sat veteran journalist Paul Danning, a man whose career thrived on provocation. His interviews weren't just tough, they were confrontational. He didn't simply moderate discussions, he aimed to dominate them. And today, his challenger was a rising conservative voice who had no intention of backing down. The segment began as expected. Paul pressed Karoline on media bias, accusing conservative outlets of spreading misinformation while insisting that networks like his were merely setting the record straight. Karoline pushed back with examples, citing instances where mainstream media had distorted narratives, omitted key facts, or misled the public entirely. It was tense but professional, until something shifted. Paul leaned in, his expression tightening, his tone growing sharper. He was no longer debating, he was attacking. "People like you," he said, frustration creeping into his voice, "are why this country is regressing. You push this false narrative of victimhood, acting like conservatives are being silenced when, in reality, you're the ones silencing everyone else." A heavy silence fell over the studio. Karoline blinked, maintaining her composed posture, but her eyes sharpened. She had faced aggressive interviews before, but this was different. She let the tension simmer before responding. "Excuse me." Paul didn't retreat. He escalated. "You act like free speech is under attack," he continued, his voice bristling. "But what you really want is control. Your people—" He stopped abruptly, but it was too late. The energy in the room shifted. The producers, once passive observers, now exchanged nervous glances. Crew members stiffened, waiting to see what would unfold next. Karoline, however, didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She simply asked, "Would you like to clarify what you mean by your people?" The weight of her words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Paul hesitated, just for a second. But 1 second was all it took. The cameras were rolling, the internet was watching. Paul Danning wasn't known for backing down. His entire career had been built on controlling the conversation, steering it to his advantage. But this time, he had lost control. The moment those two words, "your people," escaped his lips, the damage was done. It wasn't just a poor choice of phrasing. It was the implication behind it, the kind of phrase that could be dissected, replayed, and debated endlessly. And Karoline knew it. She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap, giving him the opportunity to correct himself, or to dig in deeper. Paul inhaled sharply. "I meant conservatives," he said too quickly. "People like you who push an agenda of grievance instead of progress." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Just to be clear," she said, voice calm but firm, "when you said your people, you were referring strictly to political ideology?" Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. He had played this game long enough to recognize a trap when he saw one. If he denied it, he risked reinforcing the very suspicion now spreading through the room. If he admitted it was a mistake, he would look weak. So he chose another tactic, shifting the goalposts. "Oh, come on, Karoline," he scoffed, forcing a dry chuckle. "Don't play the victim. This is exactly what I'm talking about, this bad faith outrage. You know what I meant. But instead of engaging with a real discussion, you rather twist my words and make it about you." Karoline didn't flinch. "I don't need to twist anything, Paul. Your words speak for themselves." For the first time, something flickered in Paul's eyes. Irritation, maybe even regret. But he was too deep now. He couldn't afford to retreat. And then he made a fatal mistake. "You know what?" he snapped. "Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society, we wouldn't be having this conversation." There it was, a sweeping statement, delivered with arrogance, broadcast live. The silence that followed was suffocating, not just in the studio but across the screens of the thousands, soon to be millions, watching at home. Even Paul seemed to realize his misstep the second the words left his mouth. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to soften the impact, but it was too late. Karoline let the words settle before speaking. "Are you saying conservatives don't contribute to society, Paul?" He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "I'm saying this constant whining about being cancelled is exhausting." Karoline nodded slowly. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence said everything. The damage was done, and within minutes the internet would make sure it never went away. The moment the segment ended, clips of the exchange began circulating online. A 15-second snippet of Paul's words, "Maybe if conservatives spent less time playing the victim and more time actually contributing something to society," spread like wildfire. No context, no build-up, just that sentence. Within an hour the hashtags were trending. "Fire Paul Danning at Media Bias Exposed." Karoline was right. And just like that, Paul Danning, once untouchable, was on the verge of collapse. Some took it at face value, calling Paul's words outright disrespectful. Others rushed to defend him, arguing that his comments had been misinterpreted. But the full-length clip, it didn't help his case. If anything, it made things worse. Political commentators from both sides jumped on the controversy. Some condemned him immediately, while others framed it as yet another case of selective outrage. But, regardless of which side they took, one thing was clear: people were paying attention. And then the sponsors got involved. By midday, 3 major advertisers for the Morning Current had suspended their partnerships, releasing carefully worded statements about reassessing their commitments to the network. By evening, 5 more had followed. Damage control was in full swing. Paul, for his part, remained silent, at least for now. But the network, they were in crisis mode. And Karoline? She didn't need to say anything. She simply retweeted the viral clip, adding nothing but a single thinking face emoji. But the storm was far from over. Now the network had a choice to make. Inside NBS News headquarters, the network behind the Morning Current, executives were in full-blown crisis management. The outrage wasn't dying down, it was intensifying. Viewers flooded the network's inbox with demands for action. Advertisers weren't just pausing their sponsorships anymore, they were pulling out completely. And to make matters worse, rival networks had seized the moment, turning Paul Danning's remarks into a cautionary tale of media arrogance. By mid-morning, an emergency meeting was called. The network had 2 options: defend Paul and risk further backlash, or cut him loose and salvage their reputation. For years, Paul had been one of their biggest names, a veteran journalist known for his no-holds-barred interviews. But now, he was a liability. At 3 p.m., NBS News released an official statement. "Paul Danning has been placed on indefinite suspension while we conduct an internal review of yesterday's broadcast. NBS News remains committed to respectful and fair journalism." It was corporate speak for, "We're waiting to see how bad this gets before we throw him under the bus." But the internet had no patience for half measures. A suspension wasn't enough. People wanted termination. And Karoline? She wasn't leading the charge, but she wasn't stopping it either. That evening she appeared on another show where the host asked her directly, "You think Paul Danning should be fired?" She paused, then replied, "I believe people in positions of influence should be held accountable for their words." It was measured, strategic, devastating, because the very next morning, NBS News made its final decision. At 9:15 a.m., the network announced, "Effective immediately, Paul Danning is no longer affiliated with NBS News. We thank him for his years of service. and wish him the best in his future endeavors. The media world exploded. Some called it justice, others called it an overreaction. But one thing was certain: Paul Danning was finished. And the debate had only just begun. Paul was gone, but the controversy was far from over. His firing divided the country. One side saw it as long overdue accountability, a sign that media figures could no longer talk down to half the country without consequences. To them, Paul's comments weren't just offensive, they were revealing. Proof of the condescending attitude that had dominated mainstream media for decades. The other side called it cancel culture at its worst. So a man loses his job over one comment, one mistake? What happened to debate? What happened to context? Right-wing media wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. Conservative outlets ran headlines painting Karoline Leavitt as the woman who took down Paul Danning. Fox News, The Daily Wire, and Newsmax dedicated segment after segment to dissecting the firing. Meanwhile, left-leaning figures distanced themselves from Paul, but even among them, there was unease. Because even those who disagreed with him recognized the bigger implication. If a veteran journalist could be fired overnight, who was next? And then, Paul broke his silence. Late one evening, he released a pre-recorded video statement on social media. His face was weary, his tone steady but firm. "I was fired for speaking the truth. The media doesn't want truth, they want compliance. If you step out of line, you're erased. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us." The video amassed millions of views within hours. His supporters rallied, calling for boycotts against NBS News. His critics pushed back, arguing that this wasn't about some grand conspiracy. Paul had simply crossed a line. And Karoline? She stayed quiet. No gloating, no engagement in the drama. She let the world argue for her. But this was no longer just about Paul. It was about the future of media itself. The dust was settling, but the questions raised by Paul Danning's firing weren't going anywhere. In the days that followed, every major outlet ran think pieces, panel discussions, and op-eds dissecting what had just happened. Was this justice, or was it censorship? Some saw it as a long overdue reckoning, a message that elite media figures weren't untouchable anymore. They argued that this wasn't about free speech, it was about responsibility. Words have consequences. When a journalist crosses a line, they face the fallout. Simple as that. Others weren't so sure. They warned that the real danger wasn't Paul Danning losing his job, it was the precedent his firing had set. Are we punishing people for their mistakes, or are we erasing people for having the wrong opinions? The debate stretched beyond Paul and Karoline. It became a conversation about the power of viral outrage, the role of social media in shaping narratives, the fragile state of public discourse. And as for Paul, he was out, but not done. Within a month, he launched his own independent show on YouTube, branding himself as a truth teller, silenced by the establishment. His audience? Bigger than ever. Karoline, she moved on. But her name would always be tied to this moment. She hadn't just debated a TV host, she had changed the game. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Was this justice? Or was it a dangerous precedent? Did Paul's firing restore accountability in the media? Or did it prove that public pressure now dictates who stays and who goes? And more importantly, who decides what crosses the line? One thing is certain. This won't be the last time something like this happens. And when it does, the question remains, whose side will you be on? What do you think? Should Paul have been fired, or was this cancel culture going too far? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think.